Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I'm a professor at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania and currently serving as the Bush Family Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm here, as always, with my old dear friend and co-host, Reverend Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church. That's a congregation of the PCA in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Good to be with you, Todd.
Good to be with you as always, Carl. We were just joking earlier. I was given my two young adult sons a little bit of a hard time because I'm a little bit giddy over the guest we have. A lot of our folks might not. Some of our folks will recognize his name if they've paid attention to the news in these matters. But we have a unique opportunity to talk to an actual astronaut. In fact, not just any ordinary astronaut. And so I'm trying to keep myself at some basic level of equilibrium, so I don't act like a fanboy. But Carl, we're getting we get to talk to someone that you and I used to kind of pretend we would be one day.
Yes, the gentleman's name is Jeff Williams, and it's a book actually written by an old friend of mine, Chris Anderson. I have to just say about Chris Anderson, my initial connection with Chris Anderson was that he wrote in to the Alliance, I think was, to complain about something I'd said in a
something you said. Oh, I can't imagine.
I think I made too positive a comment about rock music or something.
There you go.
Chris wrote to complain, but we stayed in, unlike what would happen on social media where the temperature immediately goes up, I think Chris and I corresponded and the temperature went down, and we've stayed in touch over the years. And he has written this rather wonderful book, forward by, I have to say, the late John MacArthur. So it tells you it's a recent book, but it might be the last thing that Dr. MacArthur ever wrote. The title is Zero Gravity: The Story of Astronaut Jeff Williams and His 534 Days in Space. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be with you today, Carl and Todd.
Yeah.
Well, I want to start by asking you the most important question. Nothing to do with theology, but what's it like being a spaceman? This is fantastic.
It's been quite a journey. I mean, it's got all of the benefits that you might imagine in terms of the unique experiences. It comes with a little bit of a cost, though, of course, like all hard things in life. But no, it's been an amazing journey, centered largely around the International Space Station and the building of it.
And you have the distinction, up until just a few years ago, of having been in space longer than anybody else. And so I would imagine physically, emotionally, all those things, that can take a toll on you. What is that like to be in a zero gravity situation for that long?
Yeah, I flew 4 times in space. The last 3 times were roughly 6 months each. And it takes about 6 weeks to recover once you get back on the ground. First, your sense of balance, you have to reacquire that because you have no sense of balance. Your vestibular system depends on gravity, of course. And then muscles and coordination and flexibility, that takes about 6 weeks or so. And then it can take a couple of years for your bones to recover in terms of calcium density. But no, it was an amazing experience, and I'm sure you're going to have some more questions on it too. By the way, I launched the first time on a space shuttle from Florida in 2000. The next 3 times, and this is important later because when we talk about the current ministry, next 3 times I launched on a Russian Soyuz from Kazakhstan. Oh, wow. So starting that age, my early 40s, I had to start learning the language. And so I had a lot of time in Russia, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, I think. But Russia is a partner with us in the International Space Station. Currently, we're the only positive engagement between countries.
Wow. So how do you end up an astronaut?
Well, when I graduated high school, I grew up on a little dairy farm in northern Wisconsin and went to the military academy. My father was working with recruiters. He was a guidance counselor in our high school, little small school. I graduated with 34 people, I think, in our class. But at the military academy, I was introduced and inspired to become a pilot, a helicopter pilot specifically. But I also learned about applying the engineering that I loved in terms of the engineering discipline as an experimental test pilot. So I set that as a goal, and along with that came astronaut. I read Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, in the late 70s, and that turned me on. And I had some mentors that one mentor in particular that was actually trying to do the same thing. So I was inspired by him and others and just set it as a goal. That was 1978 or so. And the first Army astronaut was selected in 1978, Bob Stewart. So I knew as an Army officer, I had a potential path. And it wasn't until 1996 that NASA selected me after applying for 10 years to NASA, 6 applications, interviewing 3 times before I finally wore them down.
One of the things that comes across in the book is how rigorous the medicals are. You can be... you can fail on a minor thing. Did that happen to you?
That's true. In fact, the second time I interviewed in 1992, they disqualified me medically on what I call a technicality. It had something in my blood that they had as a qualifying requirement. They had tightened the requirements that year because of anticipated needs due to long duration flights on the space station, which was anticipated to be coming in a few years after that. It took them, they disqualified so many people, I think they had to go back and scrub the requirements. And by 1996, that requirement, which was related to a thyroid product in the blood, and I still have a healthy thyroid. They scrubbed it out, so I became eligible again medically, and then was selected. But yeah, every year we go through a big battery of medical testing, and we have to pass pretty stringent flight physical, and we're working with a doctor continually. So yeah, it's kind of hard to hide medically.
Yeah. Now, when you're in an environment like that where every inch counts, every second counts, and the stakes are so high, and you're in close quarters with people, what does camaraderie look like, and how vital is that?
It's very vital. In fact, most of us are very deliberate pre-flight. Once we're assigned as a crew and we know who we're going to fly with, to invest in each other, to get to know each other, to get to know each other's families, to get to know how we can work best as a team, the strengths and weaknesses and all of that. I get the question a lot of times in press conferences and public appearances, well, do you trust the Russians, when you're launching on their rocket? And I point out in the end, after I describe how we get to know each other, that we have to trust each other. Our lives literally are dependent upon each other. So we're all pretty deliberate in that for those reasons. And obviously, you're confined in a small space for a long period of time. And all of us have a bad day every now and then. So you have to get to know people so you know when to give them a little bit of room or just a little bit of space, or find ways that you can engage with them, personally to help them out when needed.
What are the scary moments? I assume there has to be some.
Well, I never really experienced fear. I get that question a lot, but I did experience adrenaline rushes, both positive and negative. Obviously, when the rocket lights off and you leave the ground, that's a big adrenaline rush. But it's a fulfillment of anticipating that event for years, and it actually it was even more fun in my later flights to take a rookie through the experience, just kind of helping somebody catch all of the elements of the experience, because you're so sensory saturated, it's easy to miss things. Landing, coming back through the atmosphere, is equally charged, I would say.
Yeah.
Spacewalks are the highlight of the whole thing. You're outside for 6.5, 7 hours, completely dependent upon this suit. And it's hand over hand, and it's a very intense, highly choreographed time. So you're mentally focused, and it's mentally exhausting, and it's physically exhausting too because of working in the suit. Some other on the negative side, we had a case in 2006 where we had a fire on board, not open flames, but a internally melting down piece of equipment that produced a lot of smoke, and so we declare an emergency, and we've trained for those kinds of things. We have procedures for it, and thankfully we were able to neutralize that pretty quickly. A fire on board any kind of ship is not a good thing. One night, in the middle of the night, we had all the core computers that run all the systems on space station fail. We have a primary, a backup, and a standby computer. So we have redundancy, and there was all three of them failed. And
did you try turning them off and on again? Was that
we have a saying in space flight that all malfunction procedures ultimately do a power cycle. So let's just power the thing up, power back on, kind of like our computers, right? But we that was pretty tense because we lost communication with the ground, and so they had no insight into us, and they're the ones with the big team with all the experts on the ground. So, but we worked through that, and successfully got through that as well. So those are just some of the highlights. Nothing really serious.
Well, that's easy for you to say.
Todd doesn't even like catching an aeroplane. I think he's not going to be a spaceman
taking off in a
soon.
plane, man.
Well, Todd, you would appreciate then that every one of my countdowns, all four of them, I actually took a nap. Up until about 30 minutes before liftoff, because things were quiet.
You're a scary man, Jeff. I would not want to bump into you on a dark night in a back street.
Man.
Did you grow up as a Christian?
I did not. I would say we were culturally Christian. My parents and my grandfather was a founding member of the local Lutheran church. So culturally, we called ourselves Lutherans. But really, I did go 1 year in 8th grade. I was it was an early, that point in life when I was seeking questions on my own. And I did go enroll in a confirmation class for a year. I was a year behind my peers. So I think going into high school for the second year, peer pressure prevented me to continue. But I do remember being there and asking the pastor lots of questions. So I'm sure seeds were planted, at least in terms of questioning. But my wife and I didn't come to faith until we were 30 years old. 7 years into our marriage.
Wow. So you were already well on your career path by that point.
Yes, yeah. And, from an external point of view, a very successful career in the Army, doing well, and, other things overall well, but personally, our marriage was, it was taking a cost on our marriage until it led really up to a crisis moment prior to coming to faith.
Yeah, and your wife came to faith before you. Is that?
She did. From a witness of neighbors and a couple of ladies at a church sent out after she reached out to them, and we were geographically separated at the time. The Army I had just moved the family to Houston for the first time there, and the Army had sent me off to Alabama for flight refresher training. So we were geographically separated for several months. And so the phone calls in the evenings, this was 87, so before cell phones. So we would try to have a call every evening when I was back in my apartment, and they were miserable phone calls. Until one night, circumstances hadn't changed, and this was just within a couple weeks after I had moved the family in and went to Alabama. Her disposition was different. And I asked, you sound different, what's going on? She said, I've become born again. I said, what's that? And I still remember thinking, as she tried to explain it to me, that, oh no, some church got to her and they want our money. But she sent me tracts, and growing up in the Cold War, and we spent 3 years in West Germany, focused on the Soviet Union as the enemy in the early 80s. So I knew what propaganda was. To me, those tracts were propaganda, but they pointed me to the Gideon Bible in my little efficiency apartment. So I spent the next several months, really, from October of '87 into '88, studying primarily the letter to the Romans and the Gospel of John. And it was mid-January. I asked her to come down and spend the long weekend with me. Her parents watched the boys, and it was there I asked her, help me pray to commit my life to Christ. So I'm very analytical. I had to go through that process. I didn't want to jump on a bandwagon or whatnot. So anyway, that's our story of faith.
Mm. And nice plug for the Gideons, by the way. Who knows? Who knows how many people I've heard similar stories. I was in a hotel, found the Gideon Bible. That's extraordinary, God's providence.
Yes.
So how does this then become a ministry? You've got obviously some interesting opportunities, particularly now internationally. You get to the point where you're launching from halfway around the world. You're having these working relationships with Russians. How does this turn into a ministry for you?
Before I get to the Russian part, I found myself wanting, not personally, I didn't want to, but I felt myself called and given an opportunity to start teaching the Bible very early, too early, actually, looking back. Our pastor should never have turned me loose in a classroom, but I started teaching really early on. And many people influenced me, and many of our common friends. I think we go through a list and find common friends, but the one that, no surprise, that impacted me the most was John MacArthur through the radio ministry. So I really credit John and the radio ministry, Grace to You, teaching me the Bible. Now, when in Houston, when we moved back there, actually, no, after coming to faith, we ended up in a Missouri Synod Lutheran church, very good church. So we spent 30 years there. So, and I've worked a lot with, I know you guys are in PCA, right? So I'm very familiar. I worked a lot with all of the various denominations that we would have in common.
Yeah.
R.C. Sproul, I knew him a little bit, not very much, but listened to him as well a lot. But I was actively teaching from then on. If I was in town, I was teaching adults theology. By the time I get to NASA, and then a few years later, in the late '90s, started going to Russia. Of course, by that time, I'm getting the questions in public appearances: how can you be a believer and work at NASA? Or how can you be a believer and work in the field of science? Betraying the obvious assumption that most people have that there's a conflict, because that's what we've heard. Now I call that the most successful propaganda campaign in modern history to come to that conclusion. But I found myself motivated to study that question to be able to address it, which is what I do most of the time now on the road and giving talks and conferences. So I was motivated to teach the Bible when I was given opportunity. Now fast forward, so I'm going through, spending half my life in Russia. It took me a while, but I finally got connected, and we don't have time for all the details, but I got connected to the evangelical community in the Moscow area, which turns out they have a long history, very difficult history, less than 1% of the population, highly persecuted. I met many whose, at least their parents or grandparents, were imprisoned for their faith or even executed for their faith, particularly in the 60s and 70s and up until even the early 80s. But I started doing some ministry with them. One guy in particular who had a church plant in Moscow, who's really very well known worldwide in the Russian-speaking evangelical community. He's become a good friend. But over time, I became aware in God's providence of a church here in Battleground, Washington, a Slavic Russian-speaking church and the pastor had gone to a master's seminary, graduated in 2002. And ironically, I was the banquet speaker for his graduation banquet. We didn't meet or anything, but when we compared notes later, we found we crossed paths but didn't meet. But I ran into him, He's the most listened to Russian preacher in the world. He's really, I called him the John MacArthur of the Russian-speaking world. And we met in God's providence at a missionary retreat in Oxnard, California, shortly after I discovered his existence. And if you were to ask him to this day, why did they invite you to that retreat? He'd say, I have no idea, other than for Jeff and I to meet. But that started a relationship. They invited us up here from Houston to speak multiple times from 2014 until 2019. We brought our older son and his family up here, made it a family vacation for a speaking engagement, spent an extra week here. And they were so inspired by the life of the congregation here, Word of Grace Bible Church it's called, and of course the area is beautiful, that when we got back to Houston, they even brought it up, what if we moved to Washington? I said, hey, if you guys want to move to Washington, I'm ready to retire, we'll move with you, which is what we ended up doing, except the COVID shutdown was in play. So NASA asked me to not retire. Go ahead and move, but please don't retire. So I worked up here for a couple more years. But anyway, we joined that ministry, and it's been an amazing experience. So I'm serving as one of the elders here. So a lot of all the pastoral duties that you're very familiar with, and I also do a lot of speaking. I get requests all the time to, hey, come give talks or a conference or whatever, conferences or churches. So I do that as the schedule allows. That's kind of separate. So and then teaching periodically as well.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, I've found this with several Christians who also work for NASA. This real concern over the doctrine of creation. Mm-hmm. And there must be something about beholding the earth from the atmosphere that is got to be a remarkably, I would say without God, it must be a remarkably desolating experience, but knowing Christ, it must be a remarkably doxological experience.
Yeah. Another question I get is, did going to space change my relationship with God? And I say, no. Mm-hmm. And of course I do that largely for the effect, but then I'll explain that we can't come to faith in Christ, as you know, through viewing his work of creation.
Right.
It's his special revelation and the work of the Spirit in our heart. But then being of faith, trusting in Christ and having the experience, it just enriches with all the illustrations that you might imagine.
Sure.
The amazing work of creation and provisioning his creation and then the implications of we bearing his image, given the dominion mandate, and that's where I go to in my talks, is scientific endeavor was realized in the age of science because many of those scientists were driven by their faith as a calling. They were committed Christians, and the scientific endeavor that they were called to is really a component of the dominion mandate given right there in Genesis 1. So you have all those aspects, God's work of creation, provisioning his creation, turning it over to his co-regents who bear his image, charging them to subdue it, have dominion. It's all right there in Genesis 1. And then, of course, everything else we see is largely explained through 1 through 11. You have to take the flood into account. So, I point out that it's absolutely critical to a Christian faith to at least address those questions and to understand what's there in the early chapters of Genesis. I'm clearly a young Earth guy, and MacArthur and others had a big influence on me early on. Right. I remember John asking the provocative question of, okay, you're a Christian, and you're committed to Christ and the gospel, but you don't believe Genesis 1 through 11. Then where in the Bible do you begin to believe it? And in my talks, I go into the history too, the other thread of history that Charles Darwin is largely known for, but many others were. That's why I call it the propaganda campaign. They used Darwin's work and others' work to really undermine the authority of the church and the clergy, particularly in Great Britain, I think is where it started.
Sure.
to not indirectly attack the Bible, but indirectly attack it, not directly attack it, but indirectly attack it by undermining its account of creation and the flood specifically, and introducing the long ages and evolution and all that.
And one of the ways where the church, the conservative Protestant church, is rediscovering the absolutely essential matter of teaching, particularly the first 3 chapters of Genesis, is in terms of what it means to be human. So much of Carl's work over the last number of years has been wrapped up in this issue of what does it mean to be human. So what do we know? What is marriage? What is man and woman? What is gender? Those kinds of things. You can't get there apart from the first 3 chapters of Genesis.
Absolutely. And Carl, I appreciate your work. I do have
thank you.
The book. I want to get it right. Yeah, Strange New World. Right
thank you.
there. So, yeah. And I resonate with all that as well.
So there's been thankfully, a renewed interest and commitment among a growing number of conservative Protestant churches to return to the doctrine of creation and just how essential it is, not only for a Christian worldview, but for knowing how to navigate our lives.
Absolutely.
And I imagine, Jeff, that you have probably a relatively busy speaking schedule. Are you able to get out and speak at various?
Yes, I get requests. I don't have a ministry. I don't have a website. People just get a hold of me one way or another. A lot of times it's just conversations at a conference or something, and then we work. And sometimes we work a year or 2 in advance. Other times there's a hole, and they got short notice, and I can make it. So yeah, and I'm happy to do that. That's stewarding the experience, really, what God has given me over the years. This last year, I'm not traveling at all in December. My wife is very happy about that, but I think I put 100,000 miles on United.
Well, but that's small potatoes for you. 100,000 miles. I mean, come on.
Yeah. It's not only
you used to do that in an afternoon.
It's not only a slow orbit; it's only a partial orbit.
That's right. Well, this has been great. Our guest has been Jeff Williams, and the book is entitled Zero Gravity. It's by Chris Anderson, forward by John MacArthur, and it's Jeff's story. It's not just a biography, though it is that. But it really delves into his spiritual biography as well, the ministry that he has, the theological commitments that have formed so much of his own teaching and the opportunities the Lord gives him, and so it's fascinating. As I was reading, one of the thoughts I had was, man, this would be great to get into the hands of young men, so many of whom have been bereft of real challenges. They've lived their lives in front of a screen, in front of make-believe. And I thought numerous times as I was going through this would be so good for young men. It's apologetic. So if you've got, you can put it in the hands of somebody who's maybe struggling in the faith, maybe someone you're evangelizing, tells about Jeff's conversion, about his commitment to Christ. So there's so many ways that a Christian can benefit from this book. Just first of all, get it and read it. It'll bless you. It'll move you. And there's pictures. I like to have pictures in a book. Carl, remember that.
I do.
I like to see the people I'm reading about, and so yeah. So I've really enjoyed it. And if you'd like to get a copy of this book, you can go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and enter to win a free copy of Zero Gravity by Chris Anderson. It's the story of Jeff Williams and his 534 days in space, if you can even imagine it. And it's been a privilege to have Jeff on and to hear his story and to be encouraged by the Lord's grace in his life. And if you're hanging out on our website, you can make a donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals if you'd like to do that. But special thanks again to our guest Jeff Williams and for this wonderful book. Thank you for joining us today on Mortification of Spin, and we will talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.